I became kind of obsessed with this idea of writing down the thoughts that I wanted to be thinking. At first, I'll admit, it seemed weird, but over time I found myself starting to kind of like it. I began to realize that I had forgotten how to daydream, something I did a lot when I was a young boy. Dreaming about playing baseball in the major leagues, dreaming about hitting home runs in the World Series, those kinds of things. So now when I sat down to write, I would slip into this fictional world where I was insanely successful, happy, energized, healthy, fit and trim. Yeah, at the time I was sporting about 70 extra pounds of body fat. I hated writing in high school and college, but this was different. I could get lost for hours in my make-believe world, where everything was wonderful and perfect. Each week in therapy, my therapist would direct me back to the thinking that would be needed to support such a life. She encouraged me to interview any successful person I could find and ask them how they thought about things. At first, I thought that was kind of a zany idea, but then, on a whim, I asked one of my buddy's fathers, who owned a Fortune 500 company, this very question. I was amazed at the answer. It could have been taken straight out of Webster's dictionary for Pollyanna. I wish I had a tape recorder. Later that day, I wrote down everything I could remember about that conversation with him. I wondered if it was kind of a fluke, so I tried it again and again. In fact, it became one of my favorite questions to ask people who I observed to be successful. What were they thinking? If everybody who was successful thought that way, then I simply needed to think that way too, right? That is actually the foundation and premise behind neuro-linguistic programming, which I knew nothing about at the time. Maybe my therapist was trained in NLP. I don't know. I'll never know. I lost track of her a long time ago, and I've never been able to find her. My guess is she was grounded enough to not enter the world of Facebook and social media. I've never found her anywhere on the internet. But it wasn't quite that easy. Just knowing what successful people are thinking was only the beginning. I was far from being able to think that way myself. As much as I tried to think like successful people think, I always seemed to default back to my old way of thinking. I was beginning to get the impression that people either thought that way or they didn't. And maybe I was just one of those people who didn't. It got pretty discouraging sometimes, to say the least. I can't say why I kept trying. Many times I felt like bagging the whole effort. But then I would see my therapist in my mind's eye. Of course you don't believe them. You haven't thought them enough times yet. I'll never forget the look on her face when she said it, a warm, inviting, wry little smile, as if to say, come on in and join me here on the positive side. It's really pretty nice over here. I can still hear her voice in my head just like it was yesterday. In fact, her voice has been in my head in a very positive way for the past 20 years. I could tell she totally believed everything she was saying, and that she believed I could do it too. And maybe that's what kept me hooked. As time went by, I actually started to hear my own voice in my head, repeating the things that I'd been writing down. Sure, I was still launching my old default negative thoughts quite a bit, but little by little my brain was replacing the negative thoughts with the positive counter thoughts, the ones I had been diligently working on and writing down in my notebook. It was as if my brain was finally getting the message. Of course, once this began to happen, this whole thing really had my attention. There was really something to this simple act of denying the negative thoughts and writing down only their positive replacements. It felt so good. I quickly became obsessed with the process and began applying it to every negative thought process that I owned. The most visible one was the thought process that drove my overeating. It seemed like magic. I lost 70 pounds in less than 1 year. That really got people's attention. I'd always been a solid kid, never fat per se, just solid. I played starting linebacker my junior and senior year in football, if that gives you any indication. I carried about 185, maybe 190 back then. Yes, in the late 70s, I was one of the bigger guys, believe it or not. What I didn't realize until I was out of college was that I had a really distorted program in my head when it came to food. I ate what I wanted, when I wanted, and stopped only when I was full. My only saving grace was that I worked out compulsively. Baseball year-round, basketball and football when those were in season, in the gym, running. I was very active and thus could pretty much eat whatever I wanted. But when I got out of college, all of that changed. I had a real job, and then a real life when I got married. That changed my activity levels significantly, but not my eating habits. By the time I got divorced, my 180, 185 had become 250. Not pretty at all. It wasn't for the lack of trying. I went on diets, tried to watch what I ate, but that really wasn't the problem. I had the best of intentions, but I always seemed to override my own intentions. I would tell myself I wasn't going to eat more than 2 pieces of pizza, and then I would proceed to eat 5. I would tell myself I was only going to have 2 beers, and then I would have 6. You get the drill. You're doing the same thing sometimes, aren't you? As I was applying the principles of CBT and NLP to my emotional life, it dawned on me that the same thing ought to work for my physical life, like thinking about my eating, right? So I began writing down what I was thinking when I blew right past my best of intentions. And then I applied the same principle, the one I was learning in therapy. What should I be thinking instead? I was amazed at how many thoughts I had programmed into my head that allowed me to ignore my best of intentions. It's a celebration. You earned it. You've had a stressful day. This one won't hurt. Make up for this tomorrow. Life's too short. And on it went. I realized that every one of those thoughts was distorted. So I began correcting each one that I discovered, carefully writing down the exact opposite of what I was thinking. For example, yeah, it's a celebration all right, and I'll celebrate by eating what I intend. Now that's a true celebration. What I've earned is the right to eat exactly what I intend to eat and feel awesome about the experience, the feeling I get from being disciplined. Every day matters. Every bit of food matters. There's no such thing as tomorrow. Tomorrow simply doesn't exist. Now, I wouldn't just read these new opposite thoughts every day. I would rewrite them every day. My journal was filled with these new thoughts, everything that I should be thinking to carry out my new intentions. My food journal was no longer keeping track of what I ate, and it wasn't even keeping track of what I thought about food and eating. It was writing down what I wanted to be thinking, which had been derived by creating the opposite of what I had already been thinking. I can't tell you how many times I wrote these things out, but I felt like I was keeping the mead company in business. I was buying notebooks literally by the dozen. I'll admit, for just a bit, I thought I was wasting my time. Okay, actually there were plenty of occasions where I was doubtful. It seemed like no matter what I wrote, my brain would go right back to just giving me the finger and eating the pizza anyway. Man, that was frustrating. Until that day, I'll never forget it, that I was staring at a box of pizza and my brain clearly said, you know, nothing tastes quite as sweet as carrying out your intentions, and nothing feels quite as good as self-discipline. I almost dropped my plate. I swear, I wanted to turn around and see who had just whispered that into my ear. It was almost magical. I put the plate down and just walked away. I was elated and miffed all at the same time. What had just happened? Could it be the stock I had been purchasing in the mead company? What else could it be? I had worked on my anger, my stress, my depression. Now the food thing? Wow. I was determined to find out. I reasoned that the only way to really know for sure was to continue with the writing and see if it happened more frequently. I did, and it did. Before long, I realized that every logical thought I had been writing down day after day was slowly emerging in my head as my new program for governing my food intake. I can't tell you for sure how many times I wrote down these thoughts, but my best estimate is that at a normal 28 pages per line in a 70-page notebook, 2 lines per thought maybe, yields roughly 2,000 thoughts that I could fit in a spiral-bound notebook. And I literally did them by the dozen. So I'm guessing the effort maybe took around 24,000 written thoughts, all of them being carefully constructed thoughts that supported my intentions regarding food intake, written over and over again. I still wish I had those old journals. Don't know what happened to them. I had boxes of them. I'm sure I threw them out. But there were plenty.